Thanks for joining us for the second webinar in our new Manufacturing a Greener Future series. Today we're going to cover a bit of an introduction to net zero, and today's content's underpinned by our online training courses, which are free of charge to Scottish SMEs. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Greg Cranston and I work for the Manufacturing Skills Academy, one of the core business units here at NMIS. I'm going to give you a quick introduction before I hand you over to David, who will deliver the main body of the session today. Before we get started, just to cover off some housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded. If your cameras are switched off, and please keep your camera and microphone off for the duration of the workshop, and you can still submit your questions via the chat bar function, which won't be recorded. To avoid, as I mentioned, to avoid any background noise, your microphones and your cameras are off during the session, and just pop any questions into the chat tool, and we'll pick those up at the end of the session, where we'll have Q&A with all of the presenters. So today's webinar is the second in our Manufacturing a Greener Future series. The previous session covered an introduction to the circular economy, and a further session on the 21st of June will explore life cycle analysis. Lee Patterson and David Butler from the University of Strathclyde are delivering the webinar today. Have also developed our training courses that we've got available through our online learning platform, and David also leads the Low Carbon Challenge Fund Extend project. During today's session, we're looking at net zero and exploring the concepts carbon offsetting and carbon credits. We'll look at how this affects us as manufacturers, and we'll review some real-world examples of where these principles have been implemented. These sessions are designed to give you the knowledge to make some informed decisions about how your business can navigate the transition to a net zero and a more sustainable future. So before we dive into the main session, I want to give a quick overview of NMIS and what we're here to do. I feel like I've given this introduction hundreds of times, so apologies for those of you who've heard it before. However, we've got lots of people joining us today who might not be as familiar with NMIS, so I'll be as quick as I can. Just bear with me if you've heard me run through this before. So basically, NMIS is a national asset intended to support and strengthen the manufacturing community across Scotland and the UK. We work across all parts of the manufacturing sector and the supply chain, and with companies and academic institutions across the country. We're a group of specialist technology centres that you can see on the screen. After some COVID-related delays, we're due to move into our new premises towards the end of the summer and finally bringing all these different areas together under one roof. We can help manufacturers across a wide range of areas, from skills development to prototyping and process improvements. We've got access to some state-of-the-art equipment and expertise to help support businesses from large to small. As I mentioned earlier, I work in the Manufacturing Skills Academy, so I'll focus on what we do for a minute or two before we move on to the main session. So the Skills Academy is here to help companies with current and future skills needs. I want to highlight two of our current funded programmes to give a good picture of the type of support that we've got to offer. So our first programme is mainly about supporting individuals and was introduced as part of the Scottish Government's COVID response package, and it's designed to help individuals at risk of redundancy or unemployment, or people who are finding it difficult to find work. There's a range of funded placement opportunities of up to 6 months, underpinned by a range of short courses to help the candidates upskill. Our second programme is mainly focused on supporting industry, and in particular the SMEs within manufacturing. And our AMCF project is funded by the Scottish Government and European Regional Development Fund, and this project's focused on supporting SMEs. We're building a range of online content in digital manufacturing and leadership skills, and to help SMEs upscale and prepare for their digital journey. We've now got a portfolio of more than 40 online courses, including some of the content that you're going to hear about today. And these are delivered via our learning management system and are available free of charge to Scottish SMEs. We also offer a more bespoke service where we can provide a more tailored support. So in addition to our courses and our case studies, you can see some examples of the more tailored support that we offer. We can give you some one-to-one consultation, so come and talk to us about your plans or your pain points and find out how we can support. We offer a range of training through both public and private courses, and now that our COVID restrictions are lifting, we can deliver this training face-to-face or online. We can run consultancy-style workshops on a range of digital manufacturing, leadership, sustainability and advanced manufacturing topics. And we can also offer individualised learning pathways and access to our learning management system. We can also facilitate graduate placements with your business, and depending on available funding, these can be fully funded. And we also run an NG program through the Skills Academy, so for anyone looking to engage with a PhD. I was hoping to show you a brief video tour of our learning platform today, but technical issues have got the better of me, I'm afraid. So I've just got some screenshots to share with you instead, and we'll save that video for a later date. So we've focused on making our platform as engaging as an engaging experience with lots of interaction for the learner as they work through the courses. Courses include lots of different media from videos and to support the learning, and also include short quizzes and knowledge checks. On completion of the courses, your learners will be issued with a certificate to log against their CPD obligations, and you can sign up for the courses and access the platform directly via the NMIS website, where you can find details of other learning and support opportunities available through the Skills Academy and the wider NMIS group. The link at the top of the page there, I'll pop that into the chat along with the token for anyone who wants to sign up. That'll take you straight to the registration page of our platform. So, and finally, here's the MSA's small but growing team. Please feel free to get in touch with any of us to find out how we can help. And without further ado, I shall pass you on to David Butler, who will deliver the main session today.
Thank you. Right, let's get the slide shared. Okay. So to move that up. It always takes a bit of rearrangement. Can't even see myself. I can see you, Gregor. If that's a good thing or a bad thing. Right, anyway.
A bad thing, David.
Right, anyway, thank you very much for the introduction. As mentioned by Gregor, I'm David Butler from the University of Strathclyde, and my partner in crime for this presentation is Lee Patterson, who's online as well. And we've developed these as part of, as Gregor said, part of a webinar, a whole series of courses to take people on the journey for net zero. And first of all, get over I think the starting point is get over some of the terms, and there's a lot of terminology thrown around. So the whole course is circular economy. The first week, last month we did one on circular economy. This one we focus on net zero. And next month we're going to focus on something called life cycle assessment, which a lot of this is very abstract. When you start putting numbers to things, which is the life cycle assessment, and we'll touch upon that today, you realize it becomes very important and very, very powerful, especially not just for the business itself and how it's operating, particularly now with the energy costs going up, but also how you present yourself to your customers. So this project we're funded by the Low Carbon Challenge Fund, which we call the Project Extend. We're looking at extending the life of products and services. This is EU funded, and as part of that, we can go out to companies and provide free of charge services, such as looking at your energy audits and also helping you with your strategy to move forward towards net zero. So hopefully the two things are very linked and it makes sense. So a quick introduction of what we're going to cover, quite a bit. Lee and I will be doing a double act. I just do the warm up, she does the big part, and then she throws it back to me and she gets to finish off as well. So I think she gets the best deal. But really, we're going to talk about what is net zero, get some of the terminology, because it's used a lot. Politicians have really grasped the term and they're throwing it around like it means different things to everyone, but it's a great term. Net zero, carbon offset, carbon neutral, all these terms are being thrown around. So we'll go through a bit of demystifying those terms. And we put this into the first webinar as well, but it's also important to ask the question, why should we bother? Why are we moving towards a net zero economy? What are the drivers behind it? A term also thrown around a lot these days is decarbonisation. A lot of us are experiencing that. We're talking about decarbonising transport. You see in places like Glasgow, we've got electric buses, possibly hydrogen buses, electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles. All this is part of this term decarbonisation. So Lee would expand a bit on that. And we'll touch upon a bit of carbon accounting as well. So we'll go into much more detail in the next webinar on what actually entails, but really we can do normal accounting, profit and loss. Can we do the same in terms of our carbon footprint? And once we can measure it, we can then identify how to improve it. So you've got to start somewhere. You've got to be in a position where you can actually have a baseline. And that's what carbon accounting is all about. We also have things like carbon capture and carbon offsetting, and I'll explain the difference between those terms as well, because they are completely different, but sometimes bundled together. To bring all this together, rather than just making it very abstract, we've created a case study of two fictitious companies and show you, you can argue it's the good and the bad. There's no ugly in this, so just the good and the bad. And we'll go through those two and show you how the techniques are generally applied to these two car companies. Now, one actually can be an exemplar of a net zero business, while the other one is doing a term which is not very flattering to use, greenwashing, where you want quick wins, you want headlines, but really there's no substance behind it. And we'll talk about that. And Lee will finish off talking about some of the tools and also a bit about some of the pointers to other sources of information and tools available on the internet for those who are interested. So really starting with net zero, and now I can rest and pass to Lee.
Yes, thank you, David. Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Lee. And as David said, I'll just pass through these kind of sections. As I said to the guys before you all came on, I do have a bit of cough just now, so if I drop off, cough and come back on, it's not a problem with your internet, it's a problem with me, so we're okay. So firstly, what is net zero? As David said, this section is really trying to demystify what that term is. So typically net zero refers to carbon net zero. You might hear it being carbon zero, carbon net zero, or more specifically carbon dioxide. So whilst the term kind of solely relates to carbon or solely refers to carbon, and in fact that is carbon dioxide, net zero is in fact concerned with all greenhouse gases. So carbon net zero, carbon zero is really just the kind of buzzword that's been associated with the balancing of all greenhouse gases. So yeah, net zero is the balance between the amount of greenhouse gases we release into the atmosphere and subsequently remove from the atmosphere. It's not necessarily all human activity. I mean, some of this is done naturally, we'll come on to that. But essentially that's what net zero is. It's to try and make that balance between what is put out and what is taken back in. In order to reach net zero, the difference between the amount of gases produced should be equal to what we take back in off of the atmosphere. And if we can reduce the amount that we're putting out, we can subsequently reduce the amount that we have to take in. And that's where trying to remove carbon or reduce our carbon output comes from. So I hope that kind of clears it up. Net zero is really the balance between the amount of greenhouse gases that goes out and the amount of greenhouse gases that comes back in. Next slide, please, David. Thank you. So why carbon? So carbon essentially has been picked because it's the most prominent concern of the greenhouse gases. It's the one that's released probably most often. And it releases from things such as burning fossil fuels, coals and oils. So that's kind of where it gets its prominence from. Of course, humans, animals breathe out carbon dioxide too, if any of you remember that high school chemistry that we all got taught. But because this is a natural cycle with the food that you take in and convert, it's considered already balanced. There is some controversy in that, not a lot, but with population growth, there is some controversy over whether population growth of humans kind of adversely affects that. But for the purpose of today, we're going to consider it already balanced, and that's why, therefore, industrial and more human activity rather than natural cycles is what's considered under the net zero targets. As I mentioned before, carbon has become a bit of a buzzword. But again, we really need to be thinking about all greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. So what are the greenhouse gases? Again, that's probably a term that we've heard probably a bit longer than carbon net zero. I think greenhouse gases have maybe been a little more in the media since 90s, if not before. And so essentially greenhouse gas is one that aids or causes the greenhouse effect. Again, that term's been around for a while, so just to clarify, greenhouse effect is when gases in the Earth's atmosphere trap the heat from the sun closer to the Earth's surface, and it subsequently heats the planet. So that, I guess, is where the term global warming came from in the earlier days. Now it's moved on to climate change. But in essence, that's what the greenhouse effect is. It's the warming of the planet because the gases trap the heat within the atmosphere and it retains in there. Not all gases have that effect. The ones that are considered the greenhouse gases are in the green bubbles at the bottom. So methane, carbon dioxide, obviously nitrous oxide, and the darker greens, which I'm not going to embarrass myself pronouncing on a recording. These are more some that are produced from industrial practices. So carbon dioxide, methane are the ones that we hear about most often, but there is, generally speaking, 7 kind of collective terms there for your different kinds of greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. So how does this come together as net zero? So carbon, as I said, is the kind of most prominent one, and therefore it's kind of been used as the measurement for greenhouse gases. This goes against something which is called the global warming potential. So all gases have been allocated a global warming potential impact, but they may be less prevalent than CO2. So therefore, they've all been allocated a number relative to CO2 for that impact, even though we may get less of it. So the measurement of that is CO2e, which is what you might see, and really the long term for that is carbon dioxide equivalent. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll give you an example of this. So this is a GWP kind of base table. There's a reference down the bottom here, but essentially this is what the value is. So for methane, it's saying that for 1 kilogram of methane that's produced, it's essentially worth 25 kilograms of CO2, and that's where your equivalency comes from. So whilst you have much more CO2 produced on the planet, and that's why it's the concern, some of these, as you can see on the table, are really quite high numbers of their value. So if we take the sulfur hexafluoride, you can see it's 22,800 as its CO2e value. So for every 1 kilo of a sulfur hexafluoride, you would require 22,800 kilos of CO2 as your kind of equivalent amount. So I hope that makes sense. But essentially, that's why we use the term carbon. It's much more prominent, although some of them are much more harmful from a greenhouse gas perspective. That's where the term comes from. And so we use the CO2e to really just explain how each of them have an impact, and that's how it's calculated across the board. If we can go to the next slide, please. So why is net zero important? Why are we concerned with it? What's the big deal with all these greenhouse gases? So firstly, climate change. I think obviously I touched on this a little bit earlier. It has become a bit more apparent over recent years. I mean, it's been talked about for decades, but I think it's really in mainstream nowadays that we are having an impact on climate change, and simply is agreed that, generally speaking, the industrious human activity is having quite an impact on that. And so therefore, we really need to start taking account of this and trying to balance ourselves back out. Next slide, please. And that in itself has kind of driven government policies. So I think most people will be aware of the Paris Agreement from 2015, where it set a kind of worldwide target to reach net zero emissions by the latter half of the 21st century. We'll go into some more specific targets in a minute. But obviously we also had COP26 last year, and there was, again, kind of governmental targets set on deforestation. And a number of companies kind of used the opportunity here to set their own net zero targets. So they're your kind of 2 key drivers. There will be more, but those are the kind of 2 main ones that I think we need to be concerned about at the moment. Next slide, please. So looking at global net zero targets, there's 2 countries already achieved their net zero targets. We have 2 countries set for 2030 as an example on this table. There will be more. And as you can see, we go up to the UK, Japan, France, 2050. 2050 is kind of the probably the most common one. I think you'll hear of 2050 targets quite often. Scotland did set targets for 2045, so did try and jump the gun another 5 years. So hopefully that's achievable. We'll get onto that in a little bit further down the line. But yes, I think 2050 is the most prominent target that you'll hear across a lot of countries. China and India have set it a little bit later, but I think in the grand scheme of things, most countries are really setting targets for themselves based on their own research. And moving towards this net zero. So it is something that I think everyone will hear about if they've not heard about it already. And there will be policies put in place in different countries to really make sure that people are really trying to achieve that target. Next slide, please.
Just thing to mention on this one, the one country missing is United States.
Yes. that's not on the slides. So basically for global targets, for example, what are we trying to do? What are governments putting in place? So I've used the UK as an example here. The UK government has set a ban on new diesel or petrol van and car sales from 2030, which I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of, and also of hybrid vehicles from 2035. So this is really trying to push electrification, electric transportation. It may not be electric, I guess. We may have hydrogen also. But it's really trying to push what is kind of considered clean transportation by 2030 and 2035. There's also targets which I think are maybe less well known, but really to try and produce enough renewable energy to power the country's households by 2030, and again the entire grid by 2035, solely on renewable energy. So at the moment, the increase in renewables is I think is unprecedented, the speed at which they're being putting forward bids for new sites. And it's really to try and achieve these targets that the UK government has set. And yes, the Fly Zero initiative is also a target that's been set by some agencies to try and really push forward kind of electrification of short haul flights, for example. There's also hydrogen powered aircraft in the go. And I think there's a lot of work being done up in the Highlands and Islands on this. It's really quite fascinating to see what's going on there. So this slide really is trying to explain that whilst we hear of net zero, and it does seem a bit of a distant thing, 2050, there's a lot of stuff going on in this decade, really trying to push that forward. So it's something that if you're not aware of yet, it will be something that's coming to the forefront pretty soon. I guess not just across these industries, but against others. And so hopefully that's given you a bit of a snapshot of that. Next slide, please. So I would just quickly go through some decarbonisation efforts. So how can we achieve decarbonisation? So I've just put some examples here. Firstly, so move to circularity. We presented, as David mentioned, a presentation a month ago on introducing the circular economy. There's also an online course available, just explaining what that is. So again, I think it's something that will be getting a bit more popularity soon, moving towards circularity. So really trying to reduce the reliance on virgin material and reducing end-of-life waste. So really trying to move, use what we have. Reducing our needs, so turning off the light when you leave the room. I think that's been going around for a couple of decades now as well. And so essentially, if you don't need something, turn it off. We can all reduce food waste. I think there's been adverts for that. And buying products near the expiration date if you're going to use them immediately anyway. Things like that can kind of be a community way of achieving some decarbonisation across society. Moving towards, rather than what individuals do, towards businesses, it's things like investing in good decisions, so making sure you're selecting a sustainable supply chain, supporting decarbonisation solutions, so really looking at future technologies, what are people looking at creating, and finding repair and remanufacturing solutions. They are continually increasing how we can repair and remanufacture things, designing things for that. So really putting that investment in now will hopefully reap the benefits from a carbonisation point of view. And increasing our knowledge. So it's great to see so many people attending courses like this. I mean, obviously David, myself and everyone else in the call has had to learn as well. So really make sure that we're beginning to understand terms like net zero, circular economy, sustainability, greenhouse effect, so on. And learning how to affect change is a really great step to actually affecting that change. So it's great to increase that knowledge across the board. Next slide, please. So a little bit more specific examples. This is in relation to heat. So for homes, industrial processes, water, it does account for more than 50% of the energy demand on the grid. So switching to things like electrification, heat recovery, hydrogen, so on, could really greatly reduce the reliance on fossil fuel-led heating systems and therefore help decarbonise by reduction. Secondly, we've got change our use of energy. So again, I kind of touched on the fact that we're moving at great haste towards renewable energy. And so really just facilitating that, moving towards companies who use that is a great way to kind of play a part too. And thirdly, looking kind of more specifically at construction, there's quite a focus on construction. I'm not picking them out against any others by any means, but just as an example, it is a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So using kind of low carbon footprint materials, integrating nature. There's some really intelligent heating and cooling systems which can use kind of natural cycles. These are all quite important steps that could be introduced across not just construction, but across a vast array of industries. So looking for these potentially carbon saving solutions is really quite an important step towards net zero, not just from a policy-led point of view, but from an individual and business-led point of view. Next slide, please. I believe I'm passing over to David.
You are.
Yep. Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Lee. I'm going to talk about a few of the terms. We mentioned already a bit about carbon accounting, so a bit more detail here. It is one of those things which can vary in definitions, what is meant by it. But if we look at it from a more general point of view, it really is a process which we can calculate our own emissions. And there's lots of websites out there which, before the pandemic, my air travel was putting me into the blacklist as one of the worst offenders, just how much CO2 is produced just by flying. And it can also be used for organizations as well. So you can do a very structured approach to looking at the emissions from any organization. Lee's already mentioned some of the sources, such as heating, electricity consumption, simple things you can do like in the construction to reduce your emissions. The way you design the building, you retrofit it. There's a lot of ways you can reduce it, but the first stage is, can you measure it? Can you get a benchmark figure, baseline to start from? And if you can equate carbon, the actual carbon footprint, you can actually put a value to it. So at the moment, there's a lot of information, a lot of stories in the news about cryptocurrencies going downhill. Maybe the next cryptocurrency will be carbon credits. It's already been talked about and being traded, but as they have a value, it means you can actually do it in a financial way to show the real impact on the organization from their carbon footprint. And maybe we can make a decision whether it's worth offsetting, which I'll explain shortly, or actually doing something more fundamental to reduce your carbon footprint. So the term carbon footprint, a bit like greenhouse gases, been used for a long time. I remember seeing the first simple carbon footprint calculator in the 1990s. There's a wonderful book out there by the brother of Tim Berners-Lee called How Bad Are Bananas? And that takes a lot of activities you do and will show you the carbon footprint equivalent, how many CO2 equivalent units it is for you to be on this Zoom call rather than you travel into a physical venue for this presentation, for example. A lot of countries are taking it seriously. In fact, even councils, South Ayrshire Council has been one of the examples of UK authorities which is pushing carbon accounting into their way of doing business. So around the world, about 40 countries are now made it mandatory to at least report on the carbon, either as a country level or individual organizations now need to do it. If you remember going back 10 years, it was all about corporate social responsibility reports. Now there's a push to show more about your carbon footprint, so more of an environmental report, and it's becoming compulsory in many countries as we go forward. A challenge there in the last line of it, it's important to us to ensure assessments are accurate. And that's one of the challenges we find. There is no international standards organization, no ISO standard for this at the moment. So how you actually account for it is very subjective. So for example, it could be that I'm in a business where I import my products from overseas, from Asia. I can argue once they reach Scotland, that's when my carbon footprint starts, not the whole manufacturing in Asia, the whole shipping here, just when they arrive in this country. So you've got a lot of flexibility how you define it, which of course will over time be unraveled, and some will be seen as bad examples and get bad publicity, while others will be seen as exemplar. And that's a real challenge in how to define what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad when it comes to carbon accounting. So it's still early days, but it won't take long before standards are in place and accepted globally. So if we're looking at another concept, so we've got carbon accounting. Well, I'm going to produce carbon. What can I do with it? And a term which is been around since actually for over the first carbon capture system was 1972, but really it's getting a lot of attention recently. Is if we can't do anything about it, can we capture this carbon and store it somewhere? So rather than a bit like pushing the dust underneath the carpet, so you don't want to see it. But it's a bit more of an investment involved in that. And carbon capture and storage, this is really, ideally, you capture the carbon dioxide at the point of production. So it could be power generation, it could be the cement and steel industries, for example, which do have very high carbon footprints. You somehow capture it, you can transport it and store it somewhere. And storage, there's a lot of ideas out there. A lot of it is, like in Humberside, for example, is pumping it under the North Sea into the rocks, where it'll be held inside the rock and stored. Let's talk about using old mine shafts around the world for pumping in carbon dioxide there, so it gets trapped into the rock. So we're not really solving the problem, we're just pushing it somewhere. And 10 years ago, people were talking about pumping it into the sea, directly into the sea, and let the pressure keep it down there. So it's not the ideal solution, but you can see which, we're looking at all the spectrum of ideas, from actually trying to minimize it to saying, put my hands up, we can't get rid of this. This is a so-called dirty industry. What do we do to get over that problem? And that's where carbon capture and storage. And of course, as I mentioned under carbon accounting, it has a value. So each kilogram of carbon dioxide has a value. So that means to store it and to pass on to a company which is specializing in CCS is also a business case, both for the producer of the carbon dioxide, who may be penalized for it, but also there's a storage business there as well. So it creates a whole new industry. And Scotland is quite ahead in this area. Now, that's the way the modern solution, I'd say, to it. But there's also the more environmental and ecological solution is we have natural carbon sinks. And this is where we have things like moss or peat, which normally produces more, absorbs more carbon dioxide than it generates. So keeping forestry going, expanding our forests, maintaining areas of vegetation would all help reduce our carbon footprint. And all through the 80s and 90s, we don't hear it so much now. The obsession was with, chopping down the Amazon rainforest and how it was going to destroy our carbon sink. Now we don't really talk about the forest because COVID's taken over. But obviously getting rid of forests is a big no-no for our carbon sink. I mean, that's why we're having real issues now with global warming and other aspects. This is not exactly the same as a capture system, which I just described on the previous slide, but it's something which is there and we can exploit it. And particularly the thing which is more important is strengthening and protecting what we already have. So it's just something to, the biggest scheme of things is to mention this as well. So the other way of doing it is carbon offsetting, and this can be seen as a quick win. So it's a quick way to reduce, remove our emissions in carbon dioxide, other greenhouse gases by just compensating for emissions elsewhere. So, we may accept as a small company, we can't change our energy provider. We're going to have electricity coming in which has got a high carbon footprint because, in theory, say it's produced from coal, which of course is no longer the case in the UK, but elsewhere. I'm feeling a bit guilty about that. Maybe what I do is I'll plant some trees outside, and that can be used as an offset. But of course, planting trees is not a 5-minute exercise. It takes probably 15 to 20 years before you get the full benefit from those trees capturing the carbon. But that's a common way of doing it. Another way is investing in renewable energy. So a lot of companies, and this is what we've been doing through the Low Carbon Challenge Fund, is assessing companies and giving them a cost benefit analysis, whether it's, say, for example, put solar panels on the roof. Putting a wind turbine depends on the size of the company's facilities, whether that's possible, but solar panels are seen as a good solution and help offset the carbon produced. Now remember, carbon offsetting doesn't mean you're actually reducing your process's carbon footprint, you're just compensating. So it's a very quick win, also a very short win. In the long term, it doesn't solve all your problems. Other ways to do it is looking at in the building itself. Can you improve the insulation of the building? Can you look at green mark kind of standards in buildings and do something about it? It could just be putting a kind of foil on the windows to reduce the energy loss during winter, for example. Other ideas also using electric vehicles. I mean, some companies have invested in that to show that they are now looking, they can use that to offset against their carbon production. So there's some smart ways of doing it, but like I said, all these are only really short-term solutions. They don't really hit the fundamental problem, which is you've got to reduce your carbon output from your processes. So if we look at a case study, so this case study is just fictitious. I thought about how do you explain everything which we just discussed and put it together into a manageable example. So I figured that we talked about earlier about cars. We have, in this case, I called it a tale of two car companies. So we have a very nice roadster on the left-hand side, petrol engine, beautiful, sleek, classic design. This company's been making these cars for the last 30 years, some refinement on the engines and the styling, but really it's the same. And we have a new company, which we call Osprey, on the right-hand side, which has just started business, but is producing a very sleek electric vehicle. So they also have, of course, the pop electric one. They also have the petrol one, which is a bit of an issue, but we're going to focus on their electric one. So the Eagle Car Company is the left-hand side. As you can see, very generic design, but this company is made the announcement, we want to be net zero. So they have the whole policy in place, they have a plan, and they are touting themselves to customers because customers feel guilty. You're buying a petrol driven vehicle, it's a bit bad for the environment. So the company's saying, no, we've got it solved. We are a net zero company. Brilliant. People would love to do that. People would love to think when they're buying something which is helping the environment. But if we delve into a bit more detail, we find out how the company has achieved net zero. So the net zero plan, they have a factory. Inside the factory, they do a whole range of activities, including castings, including the assemble of the whole of the car and testing. And they got some consultants in, and the consultants have come out with the magic footprint number for the factory. So the recommendation is stick solar panels on the roof. That is going to help us reduce our carbon footprint, because now we're using renewable energy. It just happens the building is facing the right direction to capture the majority of the sunlight each day. And it's in the sunniest part of Scotland, which I've got no idea where that is, but let's assume it's getting good energy. So look at the figures. Company has gone from a very large carbon footprint, reduced it, but it's still not zero because they do castings. Castings requires furnaces, requires heat, energy loss, and there's still an issue of this residual carbon footprint. So the solution is offset it by planting trees. So the company says our factory is now net zero. We've got renewable energy sources. We've to offset some of the carbon being produced. We've also planted trees to get rid of the remainder. And as a company, we're net zero. Aren't we good? We've achieved it. So here you are, the Eagle Car Company, we're net zero. Now, this has been a very short-term look at things and very focused and isolated, because ultimately you have a whole range of carbon footprint for this kind of vehicle. And all they've focused on is their own company's emissions, which makes 5%. They haven't considered how the parts of the vehicle are, the parts which are brought in, where they come from, how they're made. Also, when you run a petrol car over 10, 15 years, you're going to end up producing a lot more emissions than what's accounted for by the company. So the companies took a very focused but short-sighted look at it. So the Eagle Car Company is not really net zero. It's only by a very very narrow definition, it satisfies it. So we had the second car company, the Osprey car company. So they have a net zero plan. And it's similar. They've got the factory, they've got similar issues with the fact they're making parts in casting, they've got assembly, and they've done the same kind of audit. And they've been told, your solution is to, first of all, put on solar panels. Now, this company is a bit more forward thinking. They will start looking also at how they can actually reduce their carbon footprint in some of their processes, maybe upgrading it over time. But they still got that issue because their energy is dirty. So this is scope 1 emissions, which is really focusing on the direct emissions from the processes. So in this case, it's from the actual manufacturing, from the furnaces, for the castings, and from any machines, electricity consumed, anything else coming out. So that's what Eagle Car Company focused on, was scope 1. Now, there's a lot more than just scope 1. If you're doing a net zero plan, it's not just focusing on where you are, your site. It's asking other more fundamental questions, such as our energy. Where does it come from? Is our emissions, for the power, even heat and steam we're producing, so we're actually taking in, is that produced in a renewable way? Is it from wind turbines located around Scotland, or is it from coal-fired power stations in Poland pumping electricity across from mainland Europe to here? So you have to really ask yourself the question, are we doing everything possible to reduce our emissions from our providers? So this is your scope 2, looking at emissions from power, heat and steam providers as an example. I'm still not fully there. I've covered 2 parts, but if we're really going to have net zero, I've got to think a bit wider. If it's me, if I'm doing well and my supply chain is doing badly, so what's the point in me trying to be environmentally friendly unless that gets pushed down? So scope 3 is indirect emissions. So for example, when the car is in operation, if it's a petrol driven, it's creating emissions. That's not going to be good. So that's something which that's indirect, but it does come into my bigger equation about what is my net zero plan and what is my carbon footprint. Because I'm producing a product cleanly in my mind, but when it runs, it's running very unclean. So I've actually almost passed the problem down the line. I've also got to think about my materials. Say I use a lot of plastics. Where do they come from? So obviously most plastics are made from oil. Not the best solution. Is a possibility to rethink that and look for alternatives. Even things like tires. What happens to tires at the end of their life? How is the actual tire manufactured? Is it manufactured? Is the company manufacturing it also doing what I'm doing? Looking at their scope 1 and scope 2 and also their supply chain. So it's a bit like if somebody can remember back to really the 1990s and 2000s when the quality standards became very common, ISO 9000. And ISO 9000 was for a company to improve their quality, but it also permeated into their supply chain. If you're an ISO 9000 company, you wanted your suppliers to also be ISO 9000. By doing that, you could guarantee, a much more traceable process. If anything went wrong, if you couldn't prove that you did it, you could at least show in your supply chain where it went wrong. And it's a similar ilk to this now, where we're trying to show about if my company's exemplar, my supply chain has to also be the same. So indirect emissions also go back to the fact that materials are being mined. How is the mining done? How is the transportation? If possible, could it be used from recycled material? Now, for example, aluminium. The news this week is we are looking at putting I think a 25% tariff on Chinese aluminium because they've been dumping it. We already recycle of aluminium. We produce 900,000 tons a year. Just under half of that is actually recycled in the UK. So there are metals already doing that. We don't need to always go for virgin materials. So there are options exist, but they're not all there yet. So this obviously puts pressure on the supply chain to think about more ethical ways and environmentally friendly ways of procuring the resources. So maybe now the Osprey car company plan, we've done that analysis, but a net zero plan is not a one-off. It's a living document. So over time, probably we look at increasing the use of recycled materials in our car. Why does everything have to be brand new? We should be looking at aluminium in particular, which is the most recycled metal of the lot. We can also look at our vehicle itself, our product. Can we actually focus on making it more efficient going forward? Do we have to stick with what we got, or can we, make it a longer distance, better battery life, or anything else we can do by making it lighter, for example, would also help to make it more efficient. And I mentioned that early on we have 2 vehicles. We've decided as a company, we've been focusing on the electric vehicle for net zero. We should really stop making those petrol. And as Lee mentioned, I have no choice. The legislation's in place to tell me to stop. So it's a nice thing to say, but I'm actually being forced by industry. And this is happening to all the car companies in the UK who have, admittedly, in the last few years, some of them have very rapidly introduced electric vehicles, just partly as a knee-jerk reaction to legislation, but ultimately by getting them out now, they can get better and better. By the time regulations come in, we should have some pretty good vehicles on the road. So the Osprey Net Zero Plan, as I mentioned, it's not just the company. We got to put pressure on our material providers, on our supply chain. And what that means is if our supply chain doesn't adapt, we will switch to companies which do. When I was a postgraduate, I worked with a cardboard box factory, a cardboard box maker in the Midlands. Because they adopted ISO 9000, they won £1 million contract from Land Rover, not because their boxes were better than anybody else's, but they had the documentation in place and the competitors hadn't, so they lost out. So if a company moves to be greener first, it's going to permeate through the supply chain. You can tout your green credentials, maybe not today, but in the next couple of years, you're going to find business will come your way because you've really shown that you have achieved what they are trying to achieve, and therefore they'll be choosing similar companies into their supply chain. So becoming a greener, I use the word greener because it's a process material provider, can actually be very much a competitive advantage going forward. Now, this is just on a small scale, but if I think about the Osprey company as a whole, we have a net zero plan, and we tell our suppliers, they tell their suppliers, and eventually the whole supply chain is impacted by it, and that's how you can move towards achieving net zero. I use the term achieving because for many organizations, if this is your carbon footprint, you're never going to achieve zero carbon footprint. So the only way to do the last part is probably by either using carbon capture or carbon offset. But you can see the trend has been for the company not to immediately offset their carbon, but to work towards reducing their carbon footprint until it gets to a level where you can put your hands up and say, we've done everything we can, this is our limit, we then need to think of alternatives. So a lot of companies are touting their ability and their targets. It's a political message. Shareholders want to hear companies saying, what's your net zero target? And these are some examples. Ørsted, on the left-hand side, operates wind turbine farms. It's a Danish company. For the last 5 years, I believe they've won the awards as the most sustainable company on the planet. I believe this year they lost it to Vestas, another wind turbine manufacturer. But they have set a target to be net zero by 2040. Dentsu, which is more of a marketing organization, I said the same. AstraZeneca, if we weren't familiar before COVID, we all know AstraZeneca is now, 2045. And the US company CVS Health, it's mainly does retail pharmaceuticals, 2050. Holcim, which I probably pronounced wrong because it's French, is building materials. So that is an area which is very carbon intensive. So they've set themselves a target of 2050, which is a massive challenge for that type of business. These examples I put here have all adapted to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So they are being audited to make sure they achieve it. The one which gets a lot of attention, which I think will be harder to achieve, is Amazon, purely by the fact that Amazon provides such a large platform for so many companies to be involved, and there's a lot of middle people involved in purchase of equipment, of products. It's going to be very hard for Amazon to police the whole supply chain and achieve their net zero. So in terms of warehouses, they can put wind turbines, they can put solar panels, and they can get electric vehicles. They can do that. But whether they can get the whole supply chain to follow is going to be a bit of a challenge. Not so much getting them to do it, but actually ensuring it and enforcing it will be the challenge. So I'll now pass on to Lee, who will finish off on the tools to help you succeed.
Yeah, I'm quite aware of time, so I'll just kind of fly through this. So the first tool really is life cycle assessment. We're going to be doing a talk on this in a month. But essentially, life cycle assessment is probably the most common and the most impactful tool for assessing environmental impact across all stages of a product life cycle. And so, you know, this is a tool that you'll probably hear about a bit more as you're looking into your net zero commitments. But I'll leave it to talk about in our next presentation. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to go on, there's a number of softwares, both free and paid for, which you can use for your life cycle assessment. And it might be worth looking at some of the links here. I think the slides may be available to you at a later date. But by all means, have a look at them, get a feel for them, and we'll, as I said, we'll discuss it more at our next presentation. Next slide, please. David kind of touched on science-based targets. So these have been designed to provide a clearer route to emissions and to emissions reduction for organisations. They're considered science-based because they try to align with the up-to-date climate science that's being produced and try to course a company in making changes which follow those guidance. There is step-by-step guidance on it, which is available at the direct website. Next slide, please. And looking at carbon counting and carbon footprints, I think a lot of people probably have heard of a footprint calculator, carbon calculator. It's essentially LCA, but it kind of does it for you in the background. So you typically, for some of these calculators, you just have to put in some details and it will give you a result out. So there's quite a lot available online, free at cost, at providing different levels of detail. But carbonfootprint.com is perhaps a good place to look at, even just for information. Next slide, please. Finally, where else can you get help? Obviously, as I mentioned, and I think Gregor will touch on it again, we are producing more online courses and we'll be doing more webinars. But outside of here, the Carbon Trust is a great source for help in relation to this. The Climate Change Committee produces a lot of work, so it's also worth looking there. And the UK government also has its own carbon calculator and guidance, so definitely worth a look at those three websites. I believe that is us. So sorry for the kind of whistle stop ending, but I'm aware there's some questions in the chat, so I'll just pass back to Gregor.
Gregor, you're on mute. You're stuck on mute. That's the first time I heard that expression in my life. Ah, dear. Right. Leslie, you want to go for the questions at the end, by any chance?
Let's go for it. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions and a wee comment as well. So I'm going to start with David's. With many companies, David Crawford, this is, with many companies focusing on wind power and hydrogen, what is your opinion on nuclear and its role to becoming net zero?
Actually, nuclear is making a lot of efforts. I think this is also a controversial subject, but nuclear, I mean, with SMRs, it does seem to be one of the best net zero options. And I think for UK to be resilient, we need to have that combination. We can't rely just on wind and wave power. We need that combination. So I think nuclear has to be part of the mix. The small modular reactors, does seem to be getting attention. It's got a lot of investment from the government. It does seem to be an attractive option, and we're also extending the life of some of our nuclear reactors. So I really think we need a mixture, and I think nuclear is probably one of the better examples of net zero around. So that's a very strong opinion, but I do work with the nuclear sector as well, that's why.
Great, okay. Before I go on to the next question, we've got a wee comment here from Georgie Gomez. I hope I've pronounced that okay. Very, very interesting way to explain net zero. There's still a lot of work to do. Next question from Martin Keane. What is the leading standard for carbon accounting other than LCA? Is there any entities in UK who can audit companies' carbon accounting?
So there are companies who will offer carbon accounting for you. They're probably likely to use LCA, but you don't necessarily have to do it yourself. So you can find a carbon accountancy firm in the same way you can find a financial accountancy firm. As for auditing that across the UK, I think it would be wise if there was more standards in place to ensure that all the carbon accountancy firms and all the carbon accountancy work going on within individual businesses is audited across the board, so that it provides an accurate output for each individual company. But at the moment, I think if it's new to anyone, it would be wise to approach a kind of leading carbon accountancy firm.
Thank you, Lee. Next question. If planting trees and restoring peat bogs, etc., doesn't yield immediate carbon offsets, then can companies use offsetting to reach net zero in the short term? And if so, how would they get around this?
I think I should clarify what I meant. When I said about planting trees, you don't get the full benefits of them. You still can offset planting the trees, but the full benefit of actually the trees will not, it takes years for them to actually reach maturity. So that's what I meant about that. Lee, anything you want to expand on that, or?
Yeah, I think it's a very topical discussion. I am not the biggest fan of carbon offsets, although I see that they've got a place, because we definitely need to be moving forward, and if that's a way of moving forward in the short term, great. I think planting trees versus restoring carbon sink areas is slightly different, in that sometimes planting trees is perhaps a bit of a piecemeal option depending on where it is, whereas restoring what was naturally there already and protecting it is really a way of ensuring that continues as it should have done. But I definitely think that it has a place. So if that's the way to go for a company, then it seems wise to do that.
If I remember correctly, at the moment you can also buy carbon credits. So, for example, the Scottish Forestry Commission can sell the offset from their more mature forest as well. So as a price which I think is relatively cheap at the moment, but you can't hold on to it. You can't invest now and use it later. So I believe it's I think it's a couple of pounds per ton of offset. It's quite cheap at the moment. So that's one way companies can do it immediately. You go and buy it online, which doesn't sound very credible, but it is.
Thank you both. Next question. If a company participates in UK emission trading scheme, can these emissions be considered net zero?
I'm not that familiar with the emission trading scheme, so I can't really comment on it. And if Lee, you've got any? Sorry, Kathleen, this is outside my my knowledge.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I'm not overly knowledgeable about it either. I'll be honest. I'm aware of it. The thing with net zero, I think it is quite important to remember that it is the balance between what's put out and what's put in. But it should ultimately be trying to reduce what is put out in the first place. And so if it's I think that would probably be the kind of first port of call for me, where a company should be trying to reduce those emissions all in, on top of doing things like trades, offsets and so on. But as for that particular scheme, I don't think it would be fair for me to comment further on it because I'm just not overly familiar with it. Sorry, Kathleen. I'll do some research and respond at a later date.
Thank you very much. Next question. What is the panel's view on opportunities to growing crops such as flax and hemp, whose fibres can be processed into biocomposite components for vehicles, buildings, etc.? This supporting the development of a circular economy.
Okay, yep. So biocomposites, great, sounds good. My concern with biocomposites is what you do at the end of life. So growing crops such as flax and hemp tend to be much less water intensive than perhaps other bio alternatives. The production of them is perhaps less impactful than plastics, for example. So definitely starting to use them is quite important. I think it's just equally important to think of the long term. So what's going to happen to these at the end of life? Is there a sustainable way of managing these materials? Because I think what can happen quite a lot with emerging technologies and emerging kind of materials is that we concentrate on them being better than alternatives at one stage in the life, and then not necessarily across the entire stage. So I think it'd be really important to look at what you're mixing them with to make that composite, and how you deal with that at the end of life. The second thing when you're looking at using them on things like vehicles and buildings is, of course, the safety aspect of what you're using them for. So I think it would really have to make sure we're going through the entire process of that and making sure that they're up to kind of standards that we expect, as well as being ultimately better across the life cycle. If we compare it to typical carbon composites, for example, they're very difficult to manage at the end of life. Whereas if we compare them to plastic, okay, perhaps that's not great from an environmental point of view, making the plastic, but is it quite readily recyclable at the end of life? Is there processes in place? So I think you have to look at it across the board, is my kind of long-winded opinion on it, I guess. I don't know if David has a different one.
I'll give you my standard answer, Lee. I concur. And I noticed Eric's online, Eric Boynard, who's been doing a lot of work for Scotch Engineering on net zero scales. He's put a bit more in the chat as well. So it's always great to hear Eric's input as well.
Cool. I can jump back in now that I am no longer stuck on mute. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. That's been really good set of questions coming through there at the end. Thank you very much to David and Lee for delivering all that interesting content today. Looking forward to your next session towards the end of June. And unless there's any more questions coming, there's some more questions coming through the chat just as I was about to bring things to a conclusion. I'll jump in on this one if you don't mind. We use a lot of mineral diesel and are looking to change to HVO. However, I understand there are supply limitations for HVO across the UK. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, biofuel has got its issues still, yeah, with supply chains. So, yeah, it's a bit of a challenge, I must admit. My only thought is it's not the time to do it unless the supply's there, otherwise you get stranded. I mean, it's just a supply and demand issue as far as I can understand at the moment.
Yeah, we've had similar conversations with companies that have been looking to explore these areas as well. That supply chain's just not there right now.
Yeah.
Okay, I think unless there's anything else coming through at this time, I think thank you very much for joining us. We're a little run over our 3 o'clock finish time, so I'll not keep you any longer. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you again in a month's time for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.